Welcome to Unadulterated Adultery Confessions channel. We hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, my hands fumbling with the delicate straps of my summer dress. The late afternoon sun poured through the blinds, streaking through with golden light, but my mind was elsewhere. I had just finished setting the table for dinner, waiting for him to come inside from the garden where he was fixing the broken trellis, a chore he had taken on without me even asking, as I pulled one strap back over my shoulder while adjusting my bra underneath. My fingers, though nimble in most situations, felt clumsy as I wrestled with a small clasp. Then, just as I thought I had it, the clasp securing my other strap came undone. The dress slipped, and for a fleeting moment I stood frozen in surprise, staring at my reflection as the fabric pooled at my waist, leaving me in nothing but lace and the glow of the sun. It was in that moment, just as I reached to pull the dress back up, that I heard a soft knock on the doorframe. "Dinner smells amazing. Do you need?" I turned sharply, clutching the dress against me. There stood my stepson framed by the doorway, Hudson's gaze lingering for a second too long before he realized and quickly turned his head. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice tight and hurried like he'd forgotten how to breathe. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine." I cut him off, though the heat rising to my cheeks betrayed my calm tone. "The door must have been ajar." He nodded, backing away as if the air between us had grown too charged, his eyes flickering up once to meet mine before he disappeared down the hall. I stood there for a moment, gripping the fabric of my dress and staring at the empty doorway, my heart pounding in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. I'm 49, a widow for nearly 5 years now, living in the sprawling house that feels too big and too quiet for just me. My late husband, Hudson, left me with everything I needed: comfort, security, the kind of life most people dream of. But he also left me with an emptiness I hadn't anticipated, one that seemed to echo in every room and every mundane task. Then there's Benjamin, Hudson's son from his first marriage. He's 26, now tall, with a quiet confidence that's both endearing and maddening. When Hudson passed, Benjamin had insisted on staying in my life. "Family doesn't just stop," he had said at the funeral, his hand warm on mine, his grief mirroring my own over the years. He's been my lifeline in ways I didn't expect, coming over to help with the things Hudson would have done, fixing the fence or clearing the gutters, carrying heavy boxes up from the basement. We fell into an easy rhythm, one where his company feels more like a balm for the loneliness I try so hard to hide, but lately I've noticed something. It's in the way his eyes linger a second too long when I hand him a glass of iced tea, the way he stands a little closer than necessary. When we're looking over some old family photo albums, I've tried to dismiss it as my imagination, chalking it up to the way grief plays tricks on a lonely heart. But after what just happened, after the way his voice hitched and his cheeks flushed, I'm not so sure anymore. That night at dinner, the air between us was thick with something unspoken. He sat across from me, his sleeves rolled up, his tank forearms resting casually on the edge of the table as he complimented the roast chicken I had made. I smiled, nodding at his words, but I couldn't focus. All I could think about was the moment in the doorway, the way his eyes had widened before. He quickly looked away like he'd seen something he shouldn't have, like he wanted to look longer but knew he couldn't. The thing is, I wasn't as angry as I should have been, shouldn't I? I should have felt outraged or embarrassed, or something closer to the kind of indignation a woman in my position is supposed to feel. But instead there was only a strange, unwelcome heat curling in my C******T, spreading to places I hadn't thought about in years. As I sipped my wine, I caught him glancing at me, his eyes dropping quickly to his plate. When I met his gaze for the first time, I felt something shift. It wasn't just me noticing him. It was him noticing me. Through dinner, he offered to wash the dishes. I watched him from the living room, the steady rhythm of water running and plates clicking, lulling me into a trance. His broad shoulders moved under his t-shirt as he leaned forward over the sink, and for a moment I forgot myself. I forgot that I'm the woman who raised him. I forgot the decades between us. I forgot that this was wrong. When he turned off the faucet and looked over at me, his lips parted, my heart stuttered, and I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The following morning, I stood in the kitchen pouring coffee into my favorite ceramic mug when I heard the sound of the back door creaking open. Morning Benjamin called out, his voice slightly hoarse, carrying the timbre of someone who hadn't quite shaken off sleep. I glanced over my shoulder, catching sight of him standing in the doorway. His hair was told, his t-shirt snug against his C********T, and he held a toolbox in one hand. "Morning," I replied. My voice steady, even though my pulse quickened. "Figured I'd get started on the back fence before it gets too hot," he said, stepping inside. His presence filled the room, the faint scent of earth and pine clinging to him. "Coffee?" I asked, holding up the pot. He smiled, that lopsided grin that always seemed to disarm me. "Sure, black, please." As I handed him the mug, his fingers brushed mine just for a second, but long enough to send a ripple of awareness through me. I looked up and our eyes met. It was fleeting, that moment, but it lingered in the charged air between us. The day unfolded in fragments of moments like that. Later, as I stood on the porch watching him hammer nails into the fence, I found myself studying him, his broad shoulders, the way his muscles flexed as he worked, the streak of sweat glistening at his temple. I scolded myself for allowing my mind to wander where it shouldn't, but it was hard to ignore the way he carried himself, that quiet confidence that seemed to emanate from him. At one point he glanced back over his shoulder and caught me staring. I quickly turned away, pretending to adjust the hem of my sundress, but my heart thudded against my ribs. When he finished, I brought out a pitcher of lemonade. He sat on the porch steps, his hair damp and clinging to his skin, and I joined him, handing him a glass. "Looks like you fixed it," I said, nodding to the fence only because I had such a good excuse to come over. He replied, his tone playful but his eyes searching mine. I laughed softly, but his words lingered. I could feel the weight of them, the unspoken meaning hanging in the air. That night I found myself tossing and turning in bed, my mind replaying every interaction from the day, his voice, his smile, the way his eyes had lingered. It all felt too vivid, too real to ignore. I tried to convince myself that it was harmless, that it was all in my head, but deep down I knew better. A few days later he stopped by again. "I thought I'd take a look at the deck," he said, standing in the doorway with that familiar toolbox in hand. The deck didn't need fixing. I knew it, and I was pretty sure he did too. But I stepped aside, letting him in. As he worked, I brought out a tray of iced tea. The summer heat was oppressive, and the cool drink was a welcome reprieve. He thanked me, taking a long sip, and then leaned against the railing, his gaze drifting toward me. "You know," he began, his voice low, "I think this is the first summer I've really spent time here with you." I smiled, feeling a warmth bloom in my C*******T. "I'm glad you're here, Benjamin." "I really am." His eyes softened, and for a moment it felt like we were the only 3 people in the world. Over the next few weeks, his visits became more frequent. He found reasons to be around, fixing a squeaky door hinge, replacing a light bulb, trimming the hedges in the garden. Each time our conversations grew deeper. More personal, he told me about his childhood, about how he used to resent his father for remarrying so quickly after his mother left. But then he smiled, looking at me. "Didn't take long for me to realize how lucky he was to have found you." His words caught me off guard for a moment. I didn't know what to say, but then he reached out his hand, brushing mine, and everything else seemed to melt away. One evening we sat on the porch swing, a bottle of wine between us. Conversation was light at first, memories of Hudson, stories about Benjamin's college days. But as the wine flowed, so did the words we'd both been holding back. "I never told you this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But after Dad passed, I didn't just come around to help you. I came because I needed to be here with you." His confession hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My breath hitched, and for a moment I couldn't speak. "Benjamin," I began, but he shook his head, cutting me off. "I know it's wrong," he said, his eyes searching mine. "I know how this looks, but I can't ignore what I feel." The turning point came on a rainy afternoon. He had come over to bring me a new garden hose, but the weather had taken a sudden turn, leaving us stranded indoors. The rain battered against the windows, the gray light casting long shadows across the living room. We sat on the couch, a movie playing softly in the background. I couldn't tell you what it was. We weren't paying attention. "I've been thinking," he said, breaking the silence. "About what?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "About us." My heart skipped a beat. "Then we count," I began, but he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. "Why not?" he asked, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "We're not hurting anyone. It's just us here in this moment. Why can't we have that?" His words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to argue, to push him away, but the truth was I couldn't, because deep down I wanted it too. Before I could say anything, he leaned in his hand, cupping my face as his lips brushed against mine. It was soft at first, tentative, as if he were waiting for me to pull away, but I didn't. Kiss deepened, and for a moment the world fell away. There was no rain, no judgment, no past or future. There was only us. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I couldn't stop myself. I shook my head, my hands trembling as they rested against his C*******. Don't be. We sat there for a long time, the rain continuing its relentless song on the world. Outside, neither of us spoke, but the silence was filled with an understanding that didn't need words. By the time the rain stopped, something between us had shifted. There was no going back now. The next evening, Benjamin came over again, unannounced. It was unusual even for him. I'd barely had time to process what had happened between us the day before, and seeing him there, a determined look in his eyes, made my pulse quicken. "I needed to see you," he said simply, his voice steady yet edged with something raw. I hesitated, my hand lingering on the door frame. "Benjamin, maybe we should talk about..." He stepped closer, closing the space between us. "We've been avoiding this, haven't we, for weeks, for months, and I think we both know where this is going." I wanted to argue, to push him away, to tell him this was wrong, but as I stood there, his words hung in the air, undeniable and heavy with truth. "Let me in," he said softly. His tone wasn't commanding, it was pleading, and I found myself stepping aside, letting him in, not just through the door but into the guarded part of my heart I had tried to keep locked away. We ended up in the living room. The room that once felt so large and empty now seemed smaller, thick, with unspoken tension. He sat on the edge of the couch, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. "I know this isn't easy for you," he began, his voice low, "but I can't keep pretending that what I feel isn't real, and I don't think you can either." "Benjamin," I whispered, but the words got stuck in my throat. He stood, closing the distance between us. His hand reached up, brushing a loose strand of hair from my face. The gesture was so tender, so intimate. It left me breathless. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice barely audible. Before I could stop myself, I leaned into his touch. And then, just like that, the dam broke. His lips met mine in a kiss that was anything but hesitant. It was slow, deliberate, and full of everything we'd left unsaid. His hands rested lightly on my not demanding but holding me in place as though afraid. I might vanish if he let go when we pulled apart. My breath came in shallow gasps, my mind racing with every reason. This was a mistake. But then I looked into his eyes, soft, earnest, and brimming with a kind of emotion I hadn't felt in years. "I don't want to stop," he said, his voice steady, and neither did I. We moved to the couch, the world outside fading away. The hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath us were the only sounds. He kissed me again, deeper, this time, his hands sliding up my arm. His touch ignited a warmth that spread through me like wildfire. I broke the kiss, my forehead resting against his. "This is crazy," I whispered. "Maybe," he replied, his fingers tracing slow, deliberate patterns on my back. "But it feels right." There was no denying that it did feel right, too right. His hands moved lower, gripping my waist as he pulled me closer. I let out a soft gasp, my body betraying the caution my mind tried to impose. My hands found their way to his C********, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat Benjaminieth. My fingertips tell me to stop, he said, his voice strained, his eyes searching mine. I couldn't. Instead, I leaned in, pressing my lips to his in an answer that was both an affirmation and a surrender. The next few moments blurred together, the soft brush of his fingertips against my skin, the way his lips found every place that made me shiver, the quiet whispers of reassurance exchanged in the dim light of the room. It all felt surreal, like a dream I never wanted to wake from. Time seemed to slow as we gave in into the pool that had been building for so long. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word felt like a piece of a puzzle finally falling into place. When it was over, we lay together on the couch, the room bathed in the soft glow of the lamp, his arm draped loosely around my waist, and I rested my head against his C*******, listening to the steady rise and fall of his breath. I don't regret this, he said quietly, breaking the silence. I looked up at him, my heart aching with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Neither do I admitted the words, feeling both liberating and terrifying, but as the quiet settled around us, reality began to creep back in. What we had done couldn't be undone, and while it had felt right in the moment, I couldn't ignore the questions swirling in my mind. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He tightened his hold on me, his thumb tracing lazy circles on my H*******. We figure it out together, he said. His confidence was reassuring, but I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were boundaries we had crossed, lines we couldn't pretend didn't exist, but for the first time in years I felt alive. The morning light filtered through the thick curtains, casting long golden beams on the living room floor. I sat on the edge of the couch, still wrapped in the blanket he'd pulled over me during the night. The room was silent now, save for the faint chirping of birds outside. But my mind was anything but quiet. Hudson had left before sunrise, pressing a lingering kiss to my forehead and promising we'd talk soon. I watched him walk out the door, his figure dissolving into the soft haze of dawn, and with him went the temporary euphoria of the night before. Now in the light of day, reality loomed, large and unrelenting. I traced my fingers over the curve of the mug in my hands, the coffee inside growing cold, my thoughts tangled and swinging wildly between the tenderness of his touch and the weight of what we had done. I had crossed a line I'd spent years trying to define and respect, and yet I couldn't bring myself to regret it. For the first time, in what felt like an eternity, I had felt truly seen, truly wanted. Hudson had looked at me not as someone he was obligated to care for, but as a woman with desires, fears, and longings that had been buried under layers of grief and routine. But one thought, one question hung over me like a shadow. Its answer, as elusive as sleep had been the night before. I couldn't ignore the reality of what had happened. The whispers of self-doubt and judgment gnawed at the edges of my mind. I thought of the life Benjamin and I had built together, the pieces that still lived in every corner of this house. What would he think of me now? And, Hudson, what would this mean for him, for us? I placed the mug down on the table, my hands trembling. Path forward wasn't clear, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same. A week passed before I saw Hudson again. I had spent those days oscillating between moments of clarity and waves of doubt. I kept busy gardening, reorganizing the attic, even repainting the guest bedroom, all to keep my mind from drifting back to that night. But no amount of distraction could erase the memory of his touch, the quiet intensity in his eyes, the way his voice had softened when he said my name. When he finally showed up on the porch that Saturday morning, my heart leaped and sank all at once. He looked different, calmer, more measured, but there was a tension in his shoulders that betrayed the weight of whatever he'd come to say. I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me, he admitted, standing there with his hands stuffed into his pockets. I gestured for him to come in, my voice steady, despite the flurry of emotions swirling inside me. Of course. I want to see you, he stepped inside, and for a moment we just stood there, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally he spoke. I've thought about that night, about us every day since it happened, he said, his words careful but firm. I know it's complicated. I know it's not what anyone would expect, but I can't ignore how I feel about you. I don't want to. His honesty took my breath away. I'd spent so much time second-guessing myself, imagining every possible consequence that I hadn't allowed myself to truly consider what it would mean to embrace this too. Embrace him. I'm scared. I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. So am I, he replied, stepping closer. But I'd rather be scared with you than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. His words hung in the air, and in that moment something inside me shifted as I walked him to the door. Later, his hand resting on the doorknob, he turned to face me. Come with me, he said suddenly. Come with you, where? I asked, startled. Anywhere, he said simply, his eyes holding mine. Let's leave all this behind, start fresh together. I hesitated, my mind racing with questions and doubts. But when I looked at him standing there with hope in his eyes and a quiet resolve in his voice, I felt the tiniest flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Possibility. I'll think about it, I said, finally, my lips curving into a small, uncertain smile, and as he walked away, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a new chapter. One hadn't even dared to dream of. If this story resonated with you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps us craft more engaging stories for you.